In a recent video, we touched on Sublime Text Incremental Diff, a feature that was added in Sublime Text 3.2, which allows you to track the changes made to your file so you can see where you made changes, what those changes were, and even revert some of them if you want to. That tracking stops if you close your file and reopen it at a later state, but there were some extra features also added in this build that can help with tracking changes to files over time. And this week's video is all about some of those changes, and that's why we will be discussing Sublime Text Git integration. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. ODAT Nerd here. Welcome to this video on Git integration in Sublime Text. Before we get to that, though, as a reminder, if you're finding these videos in any way useful or helpful, I'd love to know about it. So please do use those buttons down below the video to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. And as always, if you have any questions or comments on the content of this video or suggestions for future video topics, you can leave those down in the comment section below. And you can also hit me on Twitter at ODAT Nerd. The topic of today's video, however, is Git integration in Sublime Text. This was added in Sublime Text version 3.2, which is build 3200 and is the same build in which the incremental diff that we talked about in the previous video was added. Before we go any further, we should also point out that the Git integration that is currently in Sublime that we're talking about here is the native Git integration, because it has been possible for a long while to integrate things with Git in Sublime Text by using external packages like the Git package or the Git Savvy package, to name but two of them. But what we're talking about here is functionality that's native to Sublime that works as soon as you install Sublime without installing any other external software. This will just automatically work for you just like that. And this is actually a functional offshoot of Sublime Merge, another tool made by the same developers. The developers of Sublime Text developed Sublime Merge, and as a part of that, they developed a Git library for reading the state of a Git repository so that Sublime Merge can replicate it on the screen. And that library was also made available to Sublime Text. So the Git integrations that we have in Sublime Text are of a read-only nature. They can see the content of the repository and make that available to you, but it can't make any actual changes. That means you can't use it to stage changes or commit them or revert or things along those lines of actual Git commits. For that, you still do need an external software package like Git or Sublime Merge, or one of those packages I previously mentioned like Git or Git Savvy. And even Sublime Merge itself doesn't make any changes to your repository. It's purely informational. Any action you take that modifies the repository, it actually executes Git to do that very thing. Now, I'd also like to point out that there is official documentation for what we're going to be talking about in this video, which I've linked down in the description of the video. And also, the integration for Git in Sublime Text takes on two different facets, if you will. One of them we're going to talk about in today's video, which is the visualization of your Git status of files and folders. The other is being able to integrate with Sublime Merge, to call into Sublime Merge to make that tool appear and use it. That is going to be the topic of another video, because that's a fairly big topic all on its own, and I don't want this video to be super long. So let's go ahead and jump on in. If you recall from the previous video on incremental diff, if you open just any old file that you happen to have laying around on your hard drive and you decide to do something like delete some lines from that file or add whole new lines to the file, or of course, if you're using a text editor, you're probably making changes to files as well as such, then we get these indicators in the gutter to tell us where these changes have happened, and we can navigate between those changes and toggle the diff hunks to see what's in there. Come in with our mouse and select some text and copy it out, or whatever might change our fancy. And this is, of course, a great thing. And if you haven't seen that video, you can go back and watch that before you watch this one to get a sense of what's available there, because we're not going to cover what keys I was actually using here. But if you remember, the problem with this is it's remembering this state even after I save the file. But if I close the file and reopen it, What we get on disk is the same content we had a second ago, but the indications are gone now. And that's because Sublime tracks the state of this file from the point at which you originally opened it. So as long as you keep the file open, you can see the changes for your session. But if you close that file, you lose that status, which isn't the greatest thing in the world. Now, it turns out that the first item of Git integration in Sublime Text that we're going to talk about is that the incremental diff functionality actually will function with Git files as well. And you don't even have to have a folder open. As long as you have a file open that's tracked by Git, you will actually get to see that, that status in the file. So let's go ahead and show an example of that. Now, any file that's tracked by Git can be used for something like this. So I'm going to go ahead and use view package file from the command palette. I'm going to use that command to open the user preferences. These are my current settings because I keep my user package in Git so I can synchronize it across machines. And as soon as we open that, the first thing we'll notice is even though this is a file I just opened, the gutter area has an indication of lines that have been added. That's one indication that this file is a file that's being tracked by Git because you wouldn't normally see lines like this just for a regular file. But what's more, if you check down in the status area, we can now see that there's a new item here that shows that this file is on branch master and there are 3 changes here. Now, the number that you see in that little status bar indicator, by the way, is the number of things like the number of untracked files, the number of modified files, the number of unstaged changes, basically the number of changes overall that exist in that repository in some fashion on a file type basis that haven't been committed yet. And if you see that, then you know that this file is definitely tracked by Git. You can also open your console with view show console from the menu or its key binding control backtick, where you'll see a message like this. Whenever you open a file that's inside of a Git repository that Sublime is not already tracking, you'll see a message like this telling you that the Git support is now tracking a folder. And when you close that file, that package or that folder rather will be closed as well. Now the settings that are here in this file that are the additions are actually copied from the default settings, and I've just pasted them in here with their default values because in the previous video I mentioned we talked about Sublime's support for incremental diff, but what I didn't mention is that it's actually controlled by a setting. It defaults to being turned on. So if you want this support, there's nothing you have to do. It's just automatically enabled. So if you're not seeing any indicators in the gutter for yourself, one reason might be that you turned this setting off. Now, as we can see here, this is controlled by the mini diff setting, and this setting can take 3 values. The default is true, which means all files display incremental diff items in the gutter. Sometimes they refer to that as the mini diff due to this setting here. That includes files that are tracked by Git, such as this one. If you don't want this functionality anywhere at all, you can set that value to false. Alternatively, you can set it to the string auto, and in that case, you will get the incremental diff indications in the gutter, but they'll only be shown for Git files, and for other files, they will not be displayed. So if you don't necessarily care about tracking changes to non-Git files, as we saw in the previous video, can be a handy way to go back through a file and undo partial changes. You can disable that if you want. And the default value for that is true, so I haven't modified that. I like this support very much. The next thing that is interesting here for us is this Git diff target setting here, which sets whether the information in the gutter area is based on the index for Git or the head of the repository. Now, if you're familiar with Git, you're probably familiar with the head of the repository and the index or staging area, as it's sometimes called. The default value for this is index, which means that the indications in the gutter are showing changes based on the index, which means if you stage changes or partial changes, that affects what you see here. In order to demonstrate that, I'm going to use my mouse to click on this indicator in the gutter here, in the status bar here, rather, which is something that will automatically fire up Sublime Merge if you have it, and open this very repository. So I'm going to do that here. Now we can see I have 3 unstaged files, and the file we're looking at is this one. So if I was to select just that setting and stage just those lines, now that particular setting is staged and these ones aren't. And if we jump back to Sublime, we can now see that the gutter indication has changed here. So now that doesn't show as changed. We're only seeing for these other settings that there's actually something happening here. That's because the Git diff target is the index. It's only showing me changes that I haven't staged. So if your workflow in Git is to slowly add and stage partial lines, you can use this to be able to tell whether or not there are still unstaged changes. What you could also do, and this is what I like to do generally, is change this from index to head like this. And as soon as we save this setting, you can see that indicator pops back up there for that particular setting at the top. And that's because now the Git diff target is showing us the Git status based on the head of the repository, which means it's showing us changes that haven't been committed yet. Just staging these files isn't enough any longer. What we actually need to do here is actually make a commit in order to make that go away. This is how I personally prefer to use this. I want to know if there are changes that I haven't made safe by checking them into Git. The other 2 settings here, show Git status and allow Git home dir, are settings that control the thing we're going to talk about next, which is Sublime Text's ability to show you the Git status of files in the sidebar of the window. And as we can see here, show Git status is defaulted to true, and this doesn't require any external software at all, not even Sublime Merge. As long as this setting is turned on and you're using Git to track files and you open that folder in a sidebar, you will see that status. If you don't want that, you can flip this setting to false. Now note that this is one of those settings which if you change its value, you'll need to quit Sublime and restart it as well. And this last item here, allow Git home dir, this is turned off by default. If you are a person that keeps your home directory in Git, then you may or may not want to turn this setting on, because if allow Git home dir is set to true and you open your home directory in the sidebar and it's a particularly big repository for your whole home directory, that can cause a very large and perhaps unexpected CPU hit, because now the Git library has to be able to track the changes to all of the files in your home directory, which, as you can imagine, is quite a task. That's why this setting is here, to allow that for people that want to do that and understand the risks, but it's turned off by default so that you're not caught unawares and thinking that something's gone horribly wrong in Sublime when you fire it up and it's using all of your CPU. So this is the settings we're going to continue on with here, showing Git status and not allowing Git home directory. Let's show an example of the other Git tracking you can use in Sublime Text. Along with being able to use the incremental diff to be able to track the changes to your files over time in Git, either since you've last committed or since you've last staged changes, you can also track the status of files and folders as a whole if you open those folders in the sidebar and they're folders that are tracked by Git. Now, in order to demonstrate that, we're going to use the quick switch project command to open this test repo.sublime workspace, which is a folder that I have a test repository set up in. And this is something that we learned how to save a workspace with open folders and files in our video on projects and workspaces. So if you don't know how to do this, you can check out that video for that action. It's linked down in the description of this video. And as soon as we open this up, we can see immediately that there are some folders and files available over there, and they are each marked up with some level of icon to the right or a color to the text. And there are various statuses that can apply to files and folders, and the list of those is over here in the window on the right hand side here in this Scratch file that I've opened. And it's important to note that some of these statuses apply to files, like a file is a new file that's staged for addition, or it's a file that we've told something that we have made a change in, or it's even a file that we haven't told Git about. And some of these statuses, like a file is missing or a file is staged for deletion, those are items that track on folders instead, because there's no file. If a file is missing, there's no file to be able to put an icon next to say this file is missing. It's just missing, and you wouldn't know that it's supposed to be there without being able to mark it up. So for those items, the icons go next to the folders instead. And folders also display all of the icons that potentially appear for other folders and files underneath them, but there's only room for one icon. So in this list of items that we see here, this is the order of precedence from least precedence to most precedence of things that will appear within that particular folder as the icon if more than one of these statuses applies. So just going through these in order so we can see how these items are marked up. The first is an untracked file, which is the untracked.txt file at the bottom of the window. And the indication that this file is untracked, which of course means that it appears in the repository. It's not a file that Git has been told to ignore, and it's not a file that Git has been told to track, is an icon that's an open circle with a bit of a gray color to it. That's your indication that you've added a file and you haven't told Git one way or the other whether to ignore it or care about it. The next thing here is the modified indicator, which is a blue circle, and it's next to this file named modified.txt. That means that file has a modification in it that you've made, which of course means if you happen to open that file, you would see an indication in the gutter area of where those edits actually are. And that's different from the file that's underneath it, which we'll talk about in just a moment. If a file has just a modified item, then that's an item that has been modified, but that's the only status that it has applied. The next item here is missing, which is a red dot, and we can see that applying to the missing test folder up here at the top. There's a file inside of there that Git is supposed to be tracking, and it's noticed that it's gone. So the only other file that's in there is that placeholder.txt file. So in order to tell us there's a missing file there, there's that red dot on there. The next item is a staged addition, and that means that there's that a file that you have added to your repository, and you decided you want Git to track it, so you've done a git add for it. That's the added.txt file here, which has the right-facing greenish arrow type icon on it, letting you know that this is a file that's going to be going into the repository. After that is the staged delete. This is one of those statuses that can only apply to a folder, because a staged deletion on a file is, of course, a file that is no longer present to be able to be displayed in the sidebar. So that's displaying up in the delete test folder where the icon is also red, and that same staged arrow icon, which is telling us that that folder contains a file that we've told Git we want to delete. And the next item after that is unmerged. That means that there was a conflict in that file during the last Git operation. For example, you try to unpop a stash when you have modified the file that the stash is modifying, or you're merging branches. All of those great things that make our lives terrible with merge conflict resolution, all cover here. And as we can see, the conflicted.txt file has that icon there to tell us that. And that is also on the top level repository as a whole to tell us that this folder has at least one conflict in it. And we can also see there that, as I said, the list of items in this panel here on the right, those are the order of precedence for which ones will appear on a folder. So as we can see, the missing and the delete test each have only one item in there, so that's the one they display. The test repo is showing all of these statuses. There is an untracked file, there is a modified file, there is a missing file, there is a staged addition, there is a staged delete, there is an unmerged file. Unmerged is the most important. That's the folder that appears there. Now, the last thing, which isn't one of these statuses per se because it's not indicated by an icon by default, is the ignored file, which is displayed in more of a grayed out color, the same as the sample folder and the file that is stored within it. Those are files and folders that have been git added to the git ignored file. And so as a result of that, they are displayed in the sidebar with a muted color to let you know that those are files that exist, but Git doesn't care about those files at all, at least at the present time. Now, it's worth noting that what we're seeing here, the colors that are used, are based on the theme that you are using. Right now, I'm using the default adaptive theme. And these icons here can be modified by you or by another theme author, so you might not see the same icons. That also goes for colors. The colors might be different if you're not using this theme. And additionally, as we can see from the fact that some of these files that are ignored are grayed out, it's actually possible to modify your theme such that not only the icon is a particular color, but also the folder or file name as a whole, which makes that perhaps a little bit easier to see. And that's something that I'd like to cover in a video, but it's a complicated topic on its own, so we're not going to cover that in this particular video here. Look forward to that at some point in the future. And lastly, this isn't all of the Git integrations that Sublime has. There are some other ones, much like you can click that icon as we saw previously in the status bar if you have a file open that's tracked by Git to open that repository in Sublime Merge, the other tool by the same Sublime Text developers. There is other integrations that you can have going on with files in the sidebar, like being able to see easily the history of a file or folder and things of that nature. That's also not something we're going to cover in this video because it's a little bit more of a topic on its own. So look for that in a future video as well. So there we have an overview of the Git integration that was added in Sublime Text. And this is a great way to visualize your project as it's changing over time. Now, there are some other Git integrations that we haven't discussed just yet, and that involves integrating Sublime Text with Sublime Merge, another software product by the same developers. And we will get to that in a future video. For right now, I'd like to thank you for watching, and if you found this video in any way helpful or informative, I would love to know about it. So please use those buttons down below this video to subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. And as is always the case, if you have any questions or comments on the content of this video or any of the videos on the channel, or you have a suggestion for another Sublime Text topic you'd like to see me cover in a future video, you can leave those down in the comment section below, or you can also hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd. And until the next video, this is ODATNerd asking you to please have a sublime day.